To talk more on this, I do want to bring in co-founder and CEO of the Chertoff Group, Chad Sweet, also a former CIA and also a former Department of Homeland Security Chief of Staff under former President George W. Bush. And Chad, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from
Good to be
Fox.
with you.
So I did want to start off with the very latest attacks from Iran as it hit a desalination plant in Bahrain. We've seen a lot of these, so-called kinetic attacks where Iran has actually targeted physical buildings and locations, as well as previously the AWS locations as well. When we take a look at this, can you outline the significance of these attacks and the strategy behind them?
Yeah, I think history is going to record that March 2026 will go down as a very significant evolution in modern warfare. Why? Because it will record that for the first time ever, we saw a physical attack on a target of digital infrastructure. As you said before, they intentionally targeted AWS's data centers in Bahrain and in UAE. It was a strategic surgical attack in order to, as you said, knock out not only regional capability that is supporting the Gulf states who are assisting U.S. forces, but some of those facilities are also rumored to hold significant data related to Israeli military operations. And so it's important for us to step back and recognize that nothing's off limits for the Iranians. They have now crossed a line that history has not seen before. And it's also interesting because historically we have seen the Iranians, use a fairly, sophisticated level of cyber attacks, and that is one of their preferred weapons because it's the poor man's way of hitting, David versus Goliath. And right now, what we're seeing, though, I think, is that because both we and our Middle Eastern allies have, over the last several years, in response to Iranian low-level cyber attacks, we've actually hardened our systems. So what's happening now is it's actually harder to protect against some of these physical kinetic attacks. And we're seeing that not only in the data center area, we're seeing it as well, as you said, in the other critical infrastructures such as water and power.
So as the technology continues to improve, it's interesting to your point is that Iran's now going back in time, so to speak, and targeting those physical locations that hub and house the data centers there as well. As we take a look forward, does this indicate to you, if at all, the future of Iran's retaliation strategy? Are they going to continue to go down this route, or do you think it's going to be a 1-2 punch and they're eventually going to switch over perhaps to some of these cyber attacks?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is in the cyber area, normally they would have done a lot more before now. And the fact that they haven't is a tell. It's showing that I think 2 points. One is, as I mentioned before, the collective hardening of our systems by our allies and frankly, the U.S. private sector as proving to be relatively resilient. It's very difficult to be 100% perfect because our defenses have to be right 100% of the time, and they only have to be right 1% of the time. So it's an asymmetric threat that's very difficult to defend. So I wouldn't be surprised if we do see some successful Iranian attacks. I'm actually more surprised that we haven't seen any so far. We also know a few days, right before the attack itself, the United States and Israel used preemptive efforts to go ahead and reduce their ability to launch cyber attacks. What do I mean by that? They actually took down the Iranian internet to only about a 1% to 4% capability, which muted their ability to launch attacks. And so we are, I think, going to see, to your question, Stephanie, if they can't get in and use attacks, particularly on IoT, Internet of Things systems, these are industrial control systems that when they attack, it would basically lead to a physical degradation in these critical infrastructures, much the same way that the United States did in the Stuxnet attack when we took down the Iranian nuclear centrifuges without putting a single boot on the ground. When they can't do that through cyber, now they're using drones and ballistic missiles. Why? Because with drones, for example, if they hit the systems, create a fire, let's say in the AWS data center, they can actually trigger the fire suppression systems, which then release sprinklers and the water damage. So if they can't get the effect that they want through cyber and the kinetic consequence of that, then they're doing it through these physical means. And we're going to see more of that.
And Chad, I also wanted to talk about this. Iran's president actually apologizing to neighboring nations for these attacks. When we take a look at the political landscape of Iran, it's not just one group. There are different fractions among the country, and now there is a power vacuum because the supreme leader was killed along with 40 other top leaders. As we hear this apology from Iran's president to some of the neighboring nations in the Middle East that were under attack, what does this indicate to you?
It does indicate that they are in fact splintering, and I think if you look at the behaviors, it is bizarre. It looks almost schizophrenic. On the one hand, you hear there's outreach from the Iranians to start a dialogue to explore some sort of peace settlement or denouement or pause. And then on the other hand, you hear other voices saying we're going to fight to the death. We saw, as you said, the president reaching out and offering an olive branch and apologizing to the Gulf states for hitting them. And then within a matter of hours, we just saw the Bahraini salination plant attacked. And so why the schizophrenic behavior? Well, if you go back and look at it, the Iranians knew after a number of our attacks, including the nuclear attacks on Fordow and Natanz, that there was a chance that the United States or Israel or a combination could attempt a decapitation strike. And so a lot of governments will do what are called COOP-COG, or continuity of operations, continuity of government planning. When I was chief at Homeland, DHS is responsible for helping the United States government to do its continuity of government planning. We have very hardened facilities, and we have very robust plans in the event of an attack on the United States, especially post 9/11. What they recognized is that their facilities are not strong enough to withstand the likely capabilities of the United States and Israel. So what did they do? They have a thing called the Mosaic Plan, and this is basically a plan where they said if we get decapitated or disrupted at the top level, we will initiate Operation Mosaic, which means we're going to authorize various groups to now act autonomously. And that's what we're seeing right now to a degree, is the side effects of the Mosaic protocol. If you look at two examples, would be the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, the MOIS, versus the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They're two very different actors. The MOIS, think of them as the spies. Think of the IRGC as the soldiers. The spies are a lot more engaged in diplomacy and intelligence. They're a little more subtle. They're the ones I suspect that were reaching out to try to get a denouement or figure out some way to de-escalate, while at the same time the IRGC, the soldiers, were actually escalating. They always engage in very highly aggressive, highly disruptive, asymmetric behavior, including attacking critical infrastructure. So this schizophrenia is actually a byproduct of both decapitating the top leadership and the implementation of the Mosaic protocol.
And as we see these different factions with opposing viewpoints, and messaging, there's also the X factor, which is the Iranian people, the civilians. And we've heard President Trump really encouraging the civilians to take advantage of this opportunity. This also comes as we've learned that Iran has chosen a new supreme leader, although they haven't actually shared a specific name. As we take a look at, the various messaging as well as the coming weeks, is there any indication as to who might currently hold the most power and whether that is actually going to last?
Yeah, I think it's, we've heard various rumors, including the son of the recently killed Ayatollah being in the lead. I think Trump has made it clear that the United States nor Israel would accept him as the next leader. However, what's interesting is if you step back and look at it, the 2 points: first, the people piece, and then what is the United States position, depending on what happens. If you look at it, the United States has gone in with Israel and they've mowed the lawn. They're taking out the top leadership. But what the administration is saying is that, look, if there's a change in leadership, that's good if they end up being more moderate or willing to, at least they don't have to agree with everything. This is sort of the Venezuela model, right, where Trump did not demand a total change of regime. If you look at it, Maduro, his second in command, Delcy, is now in the position, and the United States is working with her. So it's a very realpolitik view of the world, which is like, we have no permanent enemies, we have no permanent friends, we only have permanent interests. So as long as the next regime bends the knee and says, we won't pursue nuclear weapons, we won't pursue ballistic missiles that can hit Israel or the United States, and we're not going to continue to fund terrorism through proxy groups, there is a possibility that the United States could work with even some remnant of the IRGC and MOIS today. But they have to have this kind of very realistic view of what's acceptable. So there doesn't have to be regime change in the end in order for the administration to claim victory. What they've done is defang the capability of the Iranians to actually kinetically or even through cyber hit the United States. So that's very significant in terms of claiming a form of success. On the other hand, on the people side, if the people rise up and they get suppressed, that's going to be very difficult for the administration to handle publicly. And then secondly, you have to look at the potential of the country to splinter, because there are multiple minority groups within the country that have different agendas. Some of them are basically backed by different neighbors. So you've got the Kurds, for example, and the Turks, and there's tensions there. There's other ethnic groups aligned with the Pakistanis. So you literally, and the Israelis over the years have fomented the desire of these groups to splinter or destabilize the central government in Tehran. So that's the scenario that would be ugly for the administration if there's a total splintering of Iran, where you get significant destabilization and any remnants of the nuclear program get, unfortunately, proliferated, where it becomes a threat either through dirty bombs or the making of some nuclear weapons separate from the Iranian central government. That's really the nightmare scenario that the administration has to worry about.
Right now, we're in day 9 of Operation Epic Fury, and we continue to see all of these developments. When you're talking about stabilization in the region, though, typically, as we take a look back, historically, as well as the geopolitical sphere that we're seeing in that region, from your viewpoint, from your expertise, what might that timeline look like in terms of when we might see a more permanent regime or leadership in that region?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's in the interest of the United States to get this over relatively soon and then have them stabilize. It's not in our interest to see this splinter, and certainly our allies in the Gulf region don't want that either. We're already seeing the consequences of destabilization in the Straits of Hormuz and the single largest increase in gas prices in 1 week in U.S. history. So where you might have a situation where there's some daylight between Israel and the United States, however, is we want to get this over relatively soon, and we want things to settle down. The president, I think, is prepared to go longer if needed in order to make sure that the capabilities that threaten the United States are truly neutered. But you could see a daylight develop between Israel and the United States over your question about when do we want it to settle down, and when can it hopefully settle down? What we are saying is that, hey, if they're neutered, we can probably, even if it's not someone we like, we can ultimately deal with them. The Israelis, though, they're dealing with a situation where over many decades they've had this violent Islamist extremism that is calling for their annihilation, and they may not see the moment of secession, of hostilities, the same way as we do. They may say, look, we have to neuter it even further ideologically, not just physically or kinetically. And that's where, in the coming days, you watch for the possibility that the United States may start to pull back our forces from the region as long as oil is flowing through the Straits of Hormuz, and that we're not seeing overt attacks against our allies, while Israel continues to conduct at least some level, maybe even low intensity conflict, to continue to do the ideological neutering of the Iranian leadership.
And Chad, you were also talking about Iran's proxies. That's the next topic that I do want to get to, because there is a concern here in the United States over possible domestic terror threats, from terrorist organizations, but also lone wolf attacks. All of this coming as President Trump has announced the replacement for DHS Secretary Kristi Noem. And I wanted to get your take on that. We're going to just step away just for a brief moment, and I wanted to bring you back as we take a look at this, because I have to imagine there might be some concerns over possible disruptions as the security level and the risk here in the United States is heightened. So we're going to get to all of that after this break. We'll be right back. Look here of the White House, President Trump replacing Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem with his intended replacement, Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin, by the end of the month. Now, all of this comes as DHS and other federal agencies are on high alert for potential domestic terror attacks amid the ongoing conflict with Iran. For more on this, I'm going to bring back Chad Sweet as we continue our conversation. And Chad, you have extensive, background and experience with this. I want to start off with any potential concern over a distraction that this shift in leadership might have, as the United States right now is on high alert.
Yeah, it's a very unfortunate turn of events, because DHS has a critical role right now in protecting the homeland. And if we look at periods of threat since 9/11, I could argue that this is arguably the highest level of threat since 9/11. And I think if we look at the capabilities of the Iranians right now, we still don't know. It's a wild card. They've had already, DHS has issued a warning to local law enforcement and other state officials that the Iranian mullahs have issued 2 separate fatwas calling on Muslims around the world to avenge the death of the Ayatollah. And as a result, it may not even be an Iranian sleeper cell that takes action. As you mentioned, Stephanie, we could see things like we just saw, unfortunately, with the loss of life and injury in Austin, Texas, where a lone wolf answers that fatwa, in the same way that we saw the fatwa that demanded that Salman Rushdie be brought to death and was attacked and lost his eye at the Chautauqua Institute event. So that happened many years after the fatwa was issued. So these fatwas remain in place. They remain a constant level of threat, even many months or days after they're issued. So I think local law enforcement is very concerned about this, and the DHS is absolutely critical in helping to coordinate and share information through what are called ISACs, or information sharing and analysis centers, with local key players that are trying to defend the country. Our local law enforcement is really the first line of defense, because they're going to be able to catch and detect things earliest, because they're at the tip of the spear domestically, and then in collaboration with DHS and FBI, run down other threats. In addition, on the sleeper cell side, when I was in office, DHS actively tracked Iranian sleeper cells in the United States. Some of them we allowed to continue to operate under very close monitoring, because we wanted to pull the weed up by the roots. We wanted to wait and see exactly how broad was the network. So there's a chance, and I think the Attorney General briefed Congress that there were a number of Iranian persons of interest that crossed the southern border that they are actively tracking. In some cases, when we were in office, if we were looking at someone who was a person of interest who had a likelihood of being involved as a known or suspected terrorist, but we had not yet gathered final critical evidence to bring them under arrest, meaning that they had they may be a legal permanent resident, then we would have other authorities, if they've had immigration violations, to be able to at least temporarily detain them, interrogate them, and have a chance to see if we could disrupt any potential terrorist plot. What I think is interesting is I don't think for a second that this administration would pause to do that if they were worried. And what you have seen, and I have seen, is very few reports of any kind of preemptive detention under other authorities So I think that speaks to the Iranian sleeper cell threat at the moment hasn't manifested, and it could be a couple of things. It could be that they're waiting and they're still operating, as I talked before about, under the Mosaic protocol, where they know they have authority to act and they're trying to figure out the right moment to do it. Or it could be that they recognize they're now isolated in the United States. The chances of them being able to go back to their homeland and be supported there is low. And it may even be the case that over the years of being inside the United States, they've now become sympathetic to us and want to be part of American society. So there are a couple scenarios, but at the end of the day, the fundamental point you made about DHS being in a leadership transition at this moment and Congress only partially funding the department is extremely dangerous. As I said, probably the most dangerous since the post 9/11 period.
And Chad, you know, what's interesting, and we were talking prior to our conversation right now about what DHS oversees. And there are actually several different areas that DHS oversees. Can you talk
Correct.
about the partial government shutdown? Which areas are still being funded, which are deemed, you know, essential services, and others which are not currently being funded? And we take a look at the economic portion of all of this and how this plays out amid the conflict in Iran.
It's a good point you bring up. So if you look at the mission of DHS, many people forget it's not just defending the homeland from a security perspective. It actually has a dual mandate to be able to also promote and support trade and commerce. And they do that through, for example, the Customs Department is the one that facilitates receiving all goods, you know, at ports, collecting duties and tariffs on those goods and services, and facilitating their delivery to the U.S. importer. That's a critical role, in addition to helping facilitate over 90 million travelers a year from foreign countries coming to the United States through our airports and our other ports of entry to promote tourism and travel. So this economic mission is extremely important. But under the rules of the United States, when I was chief, if we go into a shutdown, the department has to essentially designate what are essential personnel, and all other non-essential gets frozen. And so what we're seeing is, unfortunately, the economic agencies, for the most part, cannot be declared essential. And it's only the security pieces that are essential. And so, you know, our Border Patrol are working and staying manned at the borders, you can imagine, but we are seeing reductions in the number of customs agents receiving goods and services. And that's going to have an economic impact right at the time when Americans are really struggling with affordability. The second issue, though, is if you look at this, what I'll call structural paradox of this particular moment, that has to do with the law under the Constitution. It has to do with the fact that the one big beautiful bill, OB3, actually funded ICE, and the other components of DHS, the Coast Guard, FEMA, et cetera, are the ones that are being hurt the most by this partial shutdown, not ICE. ICE received enough funding under OB3 that they're continuing to operate. So the structural paradox of the moment is the Democrats are trying to basically extract, you know, pain on ICE to hopefully that they want, and their objectives are trying to get certain reforms or other concessions. But in fact, the pain that they're inflicting is on all the other non-ICE components. And so that structural paradox is just a reality of the moment that the political parties are going to have to figure out.
And because of the ongoing government shutdown and the funding issue involving DHS, the longer it goes on, what are those concerns from the standpoint of Homeland Security?
The longer it goes on, the more you deteriorate the capabilities of even the security piece of the mission. So if you think about our we call transportation security officers, our TSOs at the airport, who help you when you go through to securely get to your plane, ensuring that no explosives or weapons like we saw on 9/11 make it through. That's a very important mission. And those honorable men and women are serving with no pay. And they just went through this exact same thing where they had to work with no pay and expect to get it later. And these are not folks that are, living on luxury income, and they are often living paycheck to paycheck. And as you can imagine, when you're feeling that kind of financial stress, and they just went through this, as you remember, with the prior shutdown. So whatever savings that a TSO might have had, they've most likely not had a chance to rebuild in the very short period of time that they're now back again being asked to work for free until they can get paid later. And so this is definitely going to be deteriorating the capability of our men and women to stay focused on vigilantly defending against terrorists. And I think that is a real concern that the politicians need to figure out quickly to get to a solution.
As the partial government shutdown continues amid the conflict in Iran, what are those specific areas that you're really keeping a very close eye on?
Yeah, well, another one is if you look at, for example, CISA, which is it's called the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. They're the arm of the DHS that really helps defend the homeland against cyber attacks. So as we mentioned before, the temptation for the Iranians to use cyber is high because, again, it's the poor man's way of hitting back David versus Goliath. They don't have to send a missile over to hit the homeland. They can actually do it through the internet. And that makes it a very seamless and borderless attack. Unfortunately, what we've seen there is that without the funding, a number of our men and women are not operating in CISA at full staffing at a critical moment when the homeland is extremely exposed. So that's another component of DHS that I worry about immensely.
And Chad, before you let you go, is there anything else that you would want to share with our viewers as we continue to follow all of these developments?
I would just say, for those that are listening, you have an important role too, which is number one, we let the terrorists win if we ultimately live in fear and change our way of life. However, it doesn't mean that you should be afraid, but you need to be ready. So DHS has a site called ready.gov. I'd encourage everybody to go check that out. It's very helpful in terms of thinking about possible terrorist scenarios, what to look for. And again, as I mentioned before, not only is local law enforcement at the tip of the spear and seeing anomalous behavior in our communities, but you as a citizen are, as you view this show, like you have a role. And if you go to ready.gov under the terrorism scenarios, they'll give you the information of who to call specifically in the event that if you see something, say something. And I think that is, if you go back and look at the number of terrorist plots that were disrupted when I was in office, the number that were brought to our attention by fellow citizens was extraordinarily high. So don't feel awkward. It is incredibly important, the role that you play in defending the homeland.
Some really important advice right there. Chad, we appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
My pleasure.
And as we continue to talk about DHS funding, I did want to share this live look of Capitol Hill moments ago as we were in this conversation with the CEO of the Chertoff Group, Chad Sweet, Senator Chuck Schumer, talking about the Iranian conflict. And we're going to get to all of that coming up after the break. We'll be right back.